The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer above the oncology ward at Oak Creek Memorial, and Laura Bennett moved through them like a woman underwater, present but separate, breathing the recycled air of other people's lives. She'd chosen the graveyard shifts on purpose, the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. stretches when the hospital's urgency dimmed and the world compressed into smaller, quieter moments. Fewer people meant fewer questions. Fewer questions meant her hand stayed steady, her past stayed buried, and the pair of worn combat boots locked in her Honda's trunk remained exactly what they needed to be, a memory no one would ever understand. She was straightening the supply cart outside Trauma Bay 3 when the admission alert came through, the pneumatic hiss of the emergency doors followed by controlled chaos, the particular texture of organized urgency that made something ancient stir in her chest. Laura's hand stilled on the plastic medication containers. She didn't look up. She never looked up when the trauma calls came, had trained herself for 5 years to maintain the careful invisibility of a night shift nurse, someone clinical staff breezed past without seeing, someone the attending physicians never remembered by name. "Incoming," Rita said, appearing at her elbow with a clipboard. The charge nurse was 63, efficient, and one of the few people at Oak Creek Memorial who hadn't eventually tired of Laura's polite deflections. Disabled Army Ranger, 34, name's Marcus Webb. Gunshot trauma from, Rita paused, checking the field report. Marja. Afghanistan. July 2010. That's 13 years ago. Why is he just getting admitted now? Shrapnel migration, Laura said quietly, her eyes still on the supply cart. Metal fragments shift. Sometimes they wait years before they cause problems. Rita glanced at her. How did you? She stopped herself, sliding back into professional mode. Anyway, the wound's complex. Embedded fragments, compromised soft tissue, possible vascular involvement. Surgery's going to be tricky. Whoever takes this case needs to be experienced with ballistic trauma. Laura's fingers stilled on a box of adhesive dressings. Ballistic trauma. She could see it without looking, the particular architecture of high-velocity injuries, the way the trauma radiates outward from the entry point like a stone dropped in still water. She could see it because she had held those wounds open while helicopters thundered overhead, had packed gauze into cavities that went deeper than anatomy textbooks suggested they could go, had whispered to bleeding soldiers that their wives had babies waiting and they needed to hold on for 3 more minutes until the medevac cleared the landing zone. "Who's on call?" Laura asked, still moving through the motions of organizing supplies that didn't need organizing. "That's the thing," Rita said. "Surgery's already started circling. Dr. Hargrove called an emergency consult meeting about it. They're pulling specialists, Marshall from trauma, Greenbaum from vascular, even Dr. Chen from orthopedics. But nobody's jumping at it. Word is the prognosis isn't great. Ranger's already lost most of his right leg, is dealing with chronic infections from the original injury, and with 13-year-old shrapnel this deep." Rita made a small gesture that meant hospitals didn't take cases they couldn't win. High risk, complicated recovery, insurance headaches. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. Laura listened to that sound, let it fill the space where her breathing should have been loud. By 11:11 p.m., the rejection had become systematic. Dr. Marshall refused first, outside my scope, complex vascular involvement, I'd recommend transfer to Harborview. Dr. Greenbaum came next, frankly, the tissue damage is too extensive, I don't see a sustainable repair. Dr. Chen shook his head without even examining the patient. Orthopedic reconstruction on a limb that's already failed isn't compatible with this patient's prognosis. One by one, they circled the trauma bay like sharks recognizing blood they didn't want to taste, and one by one they backed away, citing liability concerns, poor surgical candidates, and resource allocation that would be better spent elsewhere. By 12:34 a.m., 14 doctors had declined. Laura was restocking the medication cart in the medication room, a small, windowless space that smelled of antiseptic and plastic, when she heard Dr. Marcus Hargrove's voice carry down the hallway. His tone had that particular timbre of a man accustomed to authority, the kind of voice that made residents flinch and nurses nod automatically, even when what he was saying was fundamentally wrong. This patient represents exactly the kind of case that hospitalizes us, Hargrove was saying to someone, probably a resident, probably someone young enough to still believe that doctors always knew what they were doing. Disabled veteran, chronic infection history, already in functional decline. Family expects miracles. Insurance denies coverage. And if we operate, we're liable for complications that were statistically inevitable. This is risk management, not medicine. The 15th consult will confirm what we already know: he needs palliative care, not surgery. 15. That was all of them. 14 refusals, and Hargrove was still out there assembling the 15th. Something in Laura's chest went very still. She had 37 minutes left on her shift. She could finish the medication cart, clock out, walk to her Honda, drive back to her apartment on Belmont Avenue, and let this morning be like every other morning: coffee, shower, bed by 8:51 a.m., another anonymous night shift tonight, and the slow, invisible continuation of a life built entirely on the architecture of what she was not. She was very good at not being things. Not important. Not military. Not the person who had learned wound care in a concrete compound outside Kandahar while helicopters landed with soldiers whose hands were already cold before they hit the metal table. Laura moved through the hospital corridors with the fluid precision of someone who knew exactly where every instrument was, every piece of equipment, every emergency protocol that lived in her hands even when her mouth said nothing. The patient was in a private recovery room, not quite ICU, but quarantined from the regular ward. Marcus Webb lay on his back with the careful immobility of a man whose body had betrayed him so many times that moving felt like a negotiation with the rules of survival. His right leg ended just below the knee, the prosthetic lying against the wall like an abandoned limb. His face was the weathered brown of someone who had spent years in the desert, and his eyes tracked her entry with the particular alertness of a man trained to notice everything that walked through a door. "Night shift?" he asked. "Wound care," Laura said quietly. She was already assessing. The bandaging was old, possibly days old, the kind of neglect that happened when cases were already written off as unsalvageable. "May I examine?" He nodded. Soldiers understood precision. Understood when someone knew what they were doing. The moment she unwrapped the dressing, her entire spinal cord recognized itself. The shrapnel pattern. The blast radius. The particular thermal damage signature that came only from one specific kind of ordnance, the kind that killed at high velocity and left permanent signatures in the flesh of anyone close enough to survive it. Couple suture technique. She was doing it before she even realized her hands had made the decision, before her conscious mind caught up to the muscle memory that lived in her fingers like a language she'd never actually forgotten. "You know this wound," Webb said. It wasn't a question. "I know the pattern," Laura replied, her voice coming from somewhere very far down in her chest. "It's a military trauma pattern. Shrapnel migration and secondary infection indicates the fragments are actively compromising tissue. The vascular concerns are real, but they're not surgical, they're anatomical. You need someone who understands embedded ballistic trauma, not someone reading from an orthopedic textbook." She was still working, still moving through the wound care with a kind of efficiency that came only from having done this hundreds of times, thousands of times, under circumstances where hesitation meant someone's daughter would grow up without a father. "I'm going to tell the charge nurse I'm handling your dressing changes," Laura said quietly. "Twice daily until we get a surgical consult that actually knows what they're looking at." She was wrapping the last of the sterile bandage when a shadow appeared in the doorway. A man in a VA surgical coat, visiting consultant, probably, someone they'd pulled in for second opinions. His name tag read Dr. Robert Torres, and his eyes went very still when he watched her finish the suture pattern. "That's a Kabul technique," Torres said quietly. "Military field surgery." "Where did you serve?" The question hung in the fluorescent air like a blade. Laura could feel Webb watching her, could feel the weight of that single moment, the moment when everything she'd constructed could collapse, when her careful invisibility could be shattered by a single name, a single unit, a single year that would explain everything her hands already knew. She looked up at Torres. And then she let exactly one tear slip free, the kind of tear that comes not from sadness but from the weight of holding something down so hard for so long that the pressure finally found a microscopic crack. She didn't wipe it away immediately. She let him see it. Let him see the cost of what she was about to say. "I'm just a nurse doing wound care," she said, her voice steady as surgical steel, and then she did wipe it away with the back of her gloved hand, her eyes never breaking from his, her entire composure saying something her words would never confirm. The policy violation report appeared on the unit board by 2:38 p.m., Laura's name printed in red marker like a scarlet letter. Dr. Hargrove had wasted no time. The charge nurse Rita showed her the document, a formal write-up accusing her of unauthorized treatment decisions, scope violation, and undermining physician authority. 3 paragraphs of carefully worded language designed to build a case, to create a paper trail that made her defiance official, documented, institutional. Laura's jaw clenched once, a single involuntary muscle spasm, then her face went blank. She read it without expression, her eyes tracking the words the way a sniper tracks a target. "He filed this 20 minutes ago," Rita whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "Laura, he's making a move. He's building something." Laura handed the paper back. "Thank you for the heads up." Her voice sounded like it came from underwater, calm, distant, belonging to someone else. She had handled worse. She had held compression bandages against a Marine's femoral artery while artillery rounds whistled overhead. She had performed field amputations in a Humvee speeding through Helmand Province with no anesthesia except the soldiers' shock and screaming. A piece of paper with her name on it was nothing. But Rita's expression told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't nothing to the hospital. This was how they dismantled you. Not with one blow, but with accumulated documentation, paper cuts that bled into your personnel file until you looked like the problem instead of the solution. The humiliation came the next morning during the official emergency performance review, scheduled for 7 a.m. before the day's shift arrived. But Hargrove didn't conduct it in his office. He conducted it in the Ranger's patient room, with the man's wife and 2 children watching from the vinyl chairs against the wall, watching as Laura prepared the morning dressing change. Hargrove entered with 2 residents in tow, surgical students eager to witness the takedown of someone who had challenged the hierarchy. He stood in the doorway for 5 seconds, letting the silence settle, letting everyone in the room understand that what came next was performance, theater, punishment wrapped in professional language. "Nurse Bennett," he said, his voice pitched to carry to the back row of what was essentially a small auditorium. "Or should I call you Nurse Nightingale?" One of the residents actually smiled. The Ranger's wife shifted in her chair, pulling her children closer. "I'm genuinely curious about something. When did we start allowing floor nursing staff to make independent clinical decisions about complex surgical cases? Remind me, did you review the contraindications? Did you consult the attending physicians? Or did you simply decide that your competency superseded theirs?" Laura's hands didn't stop moving. She was opening the sterile field, arranging instruments in precise rows, her movements carrying the kind of economy that only came from thousands of repetitions. One measured breath. She allowed herself 1 second, just one, to let her eyes find his. That was her only concession to the provocation. When she spoke, her voice dropped half an octave, the cadence shifting from servile to something else entirely. "I reviewed the case. I reviewed the contraindications. The patient needs wound care, Dr. Hargrove. I can provide that care. Can you?" His eyebrows rose, performing skepticism for the residents. "Because what I'm seeing is a floor nurse practicing medicine without a license. What I'm seeing is scope creep and professional boundary violations that could expose this hospital to significant liability." He turned to the Ranger's wife, his expression shifting to one of performative sympathy. "I apologize that our enthusiastic staff have given you false hope. This patient's prognosis remains poor. Very poor. I want to be clear about that before this nurse fills your head with unrealistic expectations." The Ranger's wife said nothing. She was watching Laura, not Hargrove. She was watching a woman who had just been publicly eviscerated maintain absolute composure while arranging 4.0 sutures in a row. A woman whose hands didn't shake. A woman who had been accused of incompetence in front of her patient and his family and who simply continued her work as if Hargrove's words were ambient noise, like the ventilator's hum or the heart monitor's beep. "I expect this behavior to cease immediately," Hargrove continued, addressing Laura directly now but still pitching his voice for the residents. "Your scope of practice is limited to comfort care and vital signs monitoring. Anything else represents a direct violation of hospital policy and your nursing license. Do you understand?" "Yes, doctor." Laura said it without inflection. She had said similar things in similar tones in a forward operating base in Kandahar in 2009 when a lieutenant colonel had questioned her field trauma decisions. She had said it while the patient lived and the lieutenant colonel never had to know that her decisions had saved his life, had saved 4 lives that night, and she had simply taken her verbal reprimand and walked back to the surgical tent to save 3 more. Understanding came from a different place than compliance. Understanding could live inside silence. Hargrove left. The residents filtered out behind him. The ranger watched Laura carefully as she continued the dressing change, and his wife stood, crossed the room, and put her hand on Laura's shoulder, a gesture that required no words, that said everything about who that room had actually witnessed that morning. Laura felt the weight of it like an anchor, like testimony, like someone had seen what was happening and chose to acknowledge the truth underneath the performance. By midday, the break room had become a minefield. Laura entered at 12:43 p.m. with a lunch she didn't plan to eat, and the temperature of the room dropped immediately. 7 nurses were clustered near the microwave, chatting about weekend plans, weekend dates, weekend escapes. The moment she sat at the table with her sandwich, the conversation stopped like a circuit breaker had flipped. Not gradually. Completely. Instantly. Someone's phone buzzed. Someone remembered a chart. Someone suddenly needed to use the bathroom. Within 90 seconds, the room had emptied, and Laura was alone with the refrigerator's mechanical hum and the fluorescent light's electrical buzz. She stared at her sandwich for a full minute without touching it, then she stood, threw it away uneaten, and left. This was Hargrove's real weapon. Not the written documentation. Not the public humiliation. The systematic dismantling of her professional community, the conversion of colleagues into empty chairs and averted eyes, the message being broadcast from every empty doorway: you are a problem, you are dangerous, you have made yourself alone. The social ostracism had the efficiency of a military operation, coordinated, deliberate, effective. He had made 1 phone call, 2 at most, to the right people, and suddenly Laura Bennett was a pariah in her own unit. That evening, during the ranger's wound care, a visiting surgeon appeared at the doorway. Dr. Chen, a VA physician who consulted with Oak Creek Memorial 1 week per month, observer status, no authority, just watching, learning, taking notes. He watched Laura work for 8 minutes without speaking, and then something shifted in his body language. His shoulders tensed. His clipboard lowered. He was watching her hands, the way she tied the cobble stitch, the specific knot combination that combined traditional military field medicine with refined surgical precision, a technique taught only to combat medics in specific theater training. A technique that shouldn't exist in a civilian Portland hospital in a nurse's hands. "That's a cobble suture technique," he whispered, just 2 words, just barely audible. "Where did you serve?" Laura's hands didn't pause. Neither did her breathing. She had trained for this moment without knowing she was training for it, every shift of her face, every modulation of her voice, every choice to keep her eyes on her work and not on his. 1 measured breath. She felt the tear forming at the corner of her left eye, and she let it come, let it track down her cheek, and then she wiped it with her shoulder without breaking eye contact with the wound before her. "I'm just a nurse doing wound care." But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came the next morning when Hargrove scheduled the follow-up performance review for 6:15 a.m., before anyone else arrived, in his office with the door locked. The official documentation phase was beginning. The case was being built. And on the second day of caring for the ranger, when Laura arrived for the morning vitals check, she noticed his color was slightly off, his baseline heart rate elevated, his breathing pattern subtly changed, the kind of variation that most nurses would dismiss as pain, as anxiety, as standard post-injury recovery. but Laura had held her hand on the chest of a dying man before. She recognized the sound of water where there should be air. She recognized the look of cardiac compromise dressed up as routine assessment. Laura's shift started at 6:41 a.m., 20 minutes before the sun broke over the Cascade foothills. The parking lot was empty except for the night staff leaving and the smell of wet asphalt rising from the pre-dawn cold. She moved through Oak Creek Memorial's corridors the way she always did, invisible, efficient, the kind of nurse everyone needed and nobody remembered seeing. Room for 12 was on the 3rd floor, cardiac monitoring station visible from the main desk. She'd checked on the Ranger every 4 hours for 31 hours straight, and his trajectory told a story that the official chart had completely missed. The infection wasn't the problem. The wound debridement she'd performed using techniques learned in a trauma tent outside Marja was holding. No, something else was happening to him, something that made his respiration shift from normal to just slightly elevated, his skin color move from healthy tan to a dusky undertone that made most people miss the warning entirely. She pushed through the heavy door. The Ranger was sleeping, his chest rising and falling under the blanket. Pulse oximeter reading 94%. Blood pressure 128/71. Everything looked fine on the monitor display. Everything looked like a routine Thursday morning vitals check. Laura moved closer and saw what the monitors couldn't tell her. His neck veins were distended. Subtle. Easy to miss if you weren't trained to recognize the early signs of fluid accumulating where it shouldn't. She'd seen this exact presentation in a forward surgical team tent when a patient with what everyone thought was a simple abdominal wound started deteriorating 6 hours post-op. That patient had survived because she'd recognized the pattern immediately. This Ranger might not. She walked back to the hallway and pulled his chart from the rack, her hand steady but her mind already moving 3 steps ahead. Admission imaging from 2 days ago. Chest X-ray looked clear. Follow-up ultrasound ordered but not yet scheduled, another victim of the systemic abandonment that had started the moment he arrived at Oak Creek Memorial with wounds that scared away 15 consecutive surgeons. The notes were sparse, clinical, devoid of the comprehensive documentation that comprehensive care required. But the history was there if you read between the lines: shrapnel wound, extensive traumatic injury, complex surgical cleanup. She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. The pericardium is the membrane surrounding the heart, and if fluid accumulated inside it, if blood from that overlooked shrapnel fragment had been slowly filling that space over the past 36 hours, then the Ranger's heart was being compressed. Tamponade. Acute cardiac tamponade, which killed people fast and without warning if nobody intervened. Laura walked back into the room. The Ranger was stirring now, eyes opening as she approached with the blood pressure cuff. His name was Michael Chen. He was 34 years old and had lost his left leg below the knee to an IED 12 months ago. He'd survived that. He wasn't going to die on her watch from something every surgeon in the hospital had been too frightened to look at closely enough. "Morning, Michael," she said, her voice the same quiet, unremarkable tone she used with every patient. "Just checking your vitals." He nodded, still half asleep. She wrapped the cuff around his arm and waited for the machine to cycle. The numbers climbed, 132/74. Up from yesterday. His pulse was elevated, 88 beats per minute instead of the 76 she'd documented at midnight. The waiting room outside was filling with morning staff now. She could hear the shift change report being given at the nursing station, Dr. Marcus Hargrove's voice carrying down the corridor as he made his morning rounds with his entourage of residents trailing behind him like pilots following a lead aircraft. His presence made the air pressure change. Everyone straightened. Everyone performed. Laura kept her hand on Michael's shoulder, reassuring him to lie back. "Just relax. You're doing great." What she said next was exactly what she would say to any patient. But what she did next violated 3 hospital protocols and contradicted standing orders from the chief of surgery himself. She reached for the ultrasound machine stored in the equipment closet at the end of the hall, wheeled it into the room, and closed the door. The portable ultrasound was a dated model, probably 15 years old, but the transducer was clean and the image processor was sufficient. She'd used equipment far older than this in conditions that would make a modern hospital administrator weep, field conditions where bleeding out was measured in minutes and your hands had to be steady enough to work by the light of a chemical glow stick. Michael watched her with the confusion of a patient who'd never been examined this thoroughly by a floor nurse before. "What's that for?" "Just want to make sure everything's healing properly," she said, and she positioned the transducer over his sternum, angling downward toward the cardiac silhouette. The monitor blinked to life. Grayscale image. The heart chambers appeared in real time, contracting and expanding in their mechanical rhythm. And there it was. A dark halo surrounding the cardiac chambers. Fluid. Blood accumulating in the pericardial sac in quantities that shouldn't exist in a stable patient. The heart itself was already showing early tamponade physiology. The chambers were compressing during diastole, a pressure phenomenon that meant the accumulating fluid was restricting blood return to the heart. If this continued for another hour, Michael's blood pressure would crash and his heart would eventually stop pumping altogether. She didn't move. Didn't change her expression. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the familiar sensation of adrenaline flooding her system and her body refusing to show it. She'd had this exact sensation standing in a trauma tent while taking fire, watching her hands move with perfect precision while her heartbeat approached 120. "You need more imaging," she said quietly. "Formal cardiology evaluation." She removed the probe, cleaned it with antiseptic wipe, and walked out of the room. The hallway was busier now. Nursing assistants moving between rooms. Resident physicians reviewing charts. The morning had shifted into high gear, and Dr. Hargrove was somewhere on the floor, surrounded by people who feared his judgment more than they respected his competence. Laura reached the nursing station and found Dr. Patel, the on-call resident from the night shift, still present for the morning handoff. He was Indian, maybe 30 years old, with the sleep-deprived eyes of someone running on his fourth consecutive 24-hour shift. He looked up from the computer as she approached. "Room for 12 needs urgent cardiology," she said. "Possible pericardial effusion with early tamponade signs." Dr. Patel blinked. "The Ranger? I just saw him an hour ago. Vitals were stable." "They're not anymore." She kept her voice level, professional, devoid of the urgency her body wanted to convey. "Fluid accumulation around the cardiac chambers. I'm concerned about progression." He stood, moving immediately toward the patient's room. For a moment, she thought it would work, that the clinical assessment would be taken seriously, that cardiology would be called, that imaging would be ordered and the tamponade would be recognized by someone with the authority to treat it. But as they passed the nursing station, there was Dr. Hargrove, still holding his morning coffee, tennis whites visible beneath his white coat. "Dr. Patel," Hargrove called out. "Morning rounds on your 3 admits. Need the presentations now." The resident hesitated. Laura kept walking. By the time she was back at room for 12, she could feel the window closing, that narrow window of opportunity where intervention would be simple and clean versus the window where it became an emergency. Michael's color had darkened slightly. His breathing was more labored now, though he might not have noticed it himself yet. Pain was information. Her body was screaming information that his body couldn't articulate yet. Cardiac tamponade didn't announce itself. It didn't send warning messages. It just squeezed. She checked the monitors again. Blood pressure 128/70. Dropping. O2 sat still 94%, but that would change fast once the tamponade progressed past the current stage. The heart couldn't maintain systemic pressure when fluid was physically preventing the chambers from expanding. What came next was decompensation. What came next was collapse. Laura pulled the crash cart close. Not obvious, just within reach. No alarms. No overhead pages. Just a floor nurse who knew what was about to happen before it happened, the way a person knows the next word in a sentence they've heard 1,000 times before. "Michael, I need you to tell me if you feel any chest tightness or pressure." "I'm fine," he said, but his hand had moved instinctively to his chest. He wasn't fine. The pericardial effusion was 240 milliliters now. She could see it in his vitals deterioration, in the subtle changes in his facial color, in the way his body was starting to show the first signs of shock even though he didn't know it yet. The fluid was squeezing his heart, restricting diastolic filling, reducing cardiac output with each passing minute. The clock on the wall read 7:23 a.m. Somewhere in the hospital, Dr. Hargrove was presenting to his morning grand rounds. 15 doctors, all of them the most skilled surgeons Oak Creek Memorial could employ, had already refused this patient. 15 men and women had looked at his injuries and calculated the liability, weighed the risk against their professional reputation, and decided the answer was no. But the ranger's heart was failing in room for 12, and Laura Bennett was the only person in the hospital who both recognized it and had the training to fix it. The monitors began their subtle escalation. Blood pressure 124/68. Heart rate climbing from 88 to 94 to 102. Not yet the crisis pattern, but moving toward it with the certainty of physics. The ranger was starting to feel it now, a slight shortness of breath, a tightness across his chest that made him shift position in the bed. "Call cardiology," he said. "Something's wrong." Laura reached for the phone. But that wasn't the moment yet. The moment was coming, it was seconds away, maybe a minute, maybe 3. The moment when the tamponade crossed from compensated to decompensated, from manageable to catastrophic. She waited. She'd trained herself to wait in conditions where waiting meant watching people die. The waiting wasn't cruelty, it was preparation. The moment would tell her what was needed. The body always told the story if you listened to it. The ranger's eyes went wide. His hand clenched the bedsheet. His blood pressure spiked, 129/75, then 131/70, then dropped like a stone, 118/62. And then, "Can't breathe," he gasped. The monitors erupted. Oxygen saturation diving from 94 to 88 to 82. Heart rate 128, climbing. The cardiac rhythm looked like a frantic dog chasing its tail, and Laura moved the way she moved in Marja when the tent was shaking from nearby detonations. The overhead intercom crackled, "Code blue, room for 12. Code blue." But Laura was already there, already moving, already reaching for what she needed with hands that remembered muscle memory older than her civilian life. The crash cart collided with the doorframe. Laura had already moved. Already calculated. Already knew the needle depth to the 1/10 of a millimeter before her hands even reached for the spinal needle from the cart's emergency tray. The ranger's oxygen saturation was dropping. 71. 68. Her eyes read the ultrasound screen she'd wheeled in 90 seconds prior, blood pooling in the pericardial sac like a slow-motion execution. 180 cubic centimeters of it, pressing against his heart like a stone on his chest. She didn't call for help. She prepped the field. Betadine swab. 3 passes. The smell of antiseptic cut through the stale hospital air, sharp, metallic, alive. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this in a Kandahar surgical tent with mortar fire overhead and nothing but a headlamp and muscle memory between her and catastrophe. The spinal needle went in at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Textbook angle. Her fingers found the anatomical landmarks the way a pianist finds keys in darkness. The needle advanced until she felt the distinct give, the fibrous pericardium parting like fabric tearing. That sensation. She knew it. She'd known it for 16 years. Blood hissed as air pressure released. The monitor beeped. Then beeped again. Then beeped in that frantic rhythm that meant the heart was drowning but still fighting. 82. 85. The syringe filled with dark venous blood. She didn't hesitate. Didn't second guess. Extracted 40 cubic centimeters. Paused. Extracted another 40. The ranger's blood pressure climbed on the monitor like a man clawing out of water. 180 total. Every drop methodical. Every withdrawal time to the cardiac rhythm she could read in her sleep. The code team burst through the doors at 20 past the hour. Resident, respiratory therapist, crash nurses, they stopped dead when they saw her standing over the patient's chest with the needle still in place, the syringe filled with dark blood, the monitor showing stabilizing vitals that had been flatlined 3 minutes prior. What in the name of, the resident started. Pericardial tamponade, Laura said. Her voice was level as glass. 180 cc extraction. Sinus rhythm restored. He's stable. One of the crash nurses, a woman named Diana who'd worked nights with Laura for 3 years, stared at the ultrasound screen, then at the needle, then at Laura's hands. Diana's jaw tightened. She knew. Not who, not what, but she knew something was catastrophically wrong with the narrative they'd all been told about the quiet oncology nurse. Laura stepped back from the bed. Removed her gloves. The ranger was breathing. His oxygen was climbing. His heart was beating without mechanical interference because she had performed a procedure that required either a cardiologist or a trauma surgeon, and she was technically a violation of every scope boundary Oak Creek Memorial had written into their policy manual. The resident was already calling the attending. The code team was already surging forward with intubation equipment they wouldn't need. Laura set the syringe down on the tray and walked out of the room. She made it exactly 7 steps down the hallway before footsteps behind her became purposeful. Heavy. Authority-coded. Dr. Marcus Hargrove appeared at the corridor intersection with his white coat unbuttoned and his face the color of old concrete. 20 minutes. He'd been gone for 20 minutes, and in that time, the case he'd buried, the diagnosis he'd missed, the ranger he'd abandoned alongside 15 other physicians who'd all calculated liability and walked away, had somehow resolved itself. And the resolution was a problem that couldn't be fixed with a phone call or a piss favor. He saw the ultrasound probe in her hand. He saw the crash cart she'd pushed. He saw the trajectory of a patient whose cardiac tamponade should have been catastrophic and was instead a controlled save. And he understood, with the clarity of a surgeon trained to read tissue and systems, exactly what had happened. His jaw clenched so hard the muscles bulged beneath his skin. Bennett. Not a question. Not a greeting. A summoning. Laura kept walking toward the break room. Not running. Never running. Running would confirm that she understood the stakes. That she knew what was about to unfold. My office. Now. She didn't turn around. But she stopped. And she changed direction. By that afternoon, the machinery was in motion with the efficiency of something well-oiled and well-rehearsed. Hargrove had made calls. 3 board members who owed him referrals for their private practices answered on the first ring. The nursing director, Sharon Mills, received a carefully worded email describing Laura's pattern of insubordination, unsafe scope violations, and today's unauthorized invasive procedure that endangered a patient despite multiple warnings. The outside consultant arrived by evening. Dr. Shaw from a healthcare compliance firm in Seattle, brought in to investigate credential anomalies. He'd started with the easy part, running Laura's nursing license through the state database. Valid. Current. Clear standing. But then he'd looked at her employment history, 5 years at Oak Creek Memorial, no work history before that, no listed previous employers, no educational records before the associate's degree from Portland Community College registered 8 years prior. It was as if Laura Bennett had materialized from nothing in 2016. By 7 in the morning, the termination letter had been drafted and printed on hospital letterhead. By 8, Laura was summoned to Sharon Mills' office. The nursing director sat behind her desk. Hargrove stood beside her, arms crossed like evidence itself. Dr. Shaw occupied a folding chair in the corner, laptop open, expression professionally neutral. Laura, there are serious questions about your credentials, Mills began, and Laura could hear the reluctance in her voice. Mills was a good administrator, a fair woman who'd worked night shift herself for 15 years before moving to management. This was hard for her. Your nursing license is valid, but your employment history has significant unexplained gaps. Dr. Shaw has found concerns about misrepresentation on your original hire paperwork. Laura tried. She actually tried to construct a defense that wouldn't blow open her entire life. I have a valid Oregon RN license. I passed all boards. I passed the background check when I was hired. You also performed an invasive cardiac procedure outside your scope of practice, Hargrove interrupted, his voice smooth as poison. You endangered a patient despite warnings from this department. And you've demonstrated repeated insubordination that compromised the chain of command. Mills slid a folder across the desk. The letter was already signed. Effective immediately. Falsified credential documentation. Scope violations. Laura read the words like they belonged to someone else. Security arrived at her locker 14 minutes later. The guard, a man named Dennis who'd always nodded hello, wouldn't meet her eyes as he waited while she emptied her locker of scrubs and personal items. Her hospital badge was confiscated and logged. A security escort walked her to the parking garage, and Dennis's apology was genuine but useless. I'm sorry, Ms. Bennett. Just following procedure. Procedure. Policy. Authority structures that existed to protect institutions, not people. Laura had spent 16 years in military hierarchies that functioned the same way. Obey or be eliminated. Question or be processed. The uniform was different, civilian scrubs instead of Navy working uniform type 1, but the mechanism was identical. She sat in her Honda for 20 minutes in the grey Portland morning, hands on the steering wheel, not turning the key. Her hospital badge sat on the passenger seat like a severed tie to the last legitimate thing she'd built. 14 years of patient care. Thousands of dressing changes. Hundreds of nights spent with people in their worst moments. Gone. Categorized as a falsification and filed away. Finally, she reached for the trunk release button. The mechanism clicked. The trunk lid rose. And there they were, the worn combat boots in their plastic bag, the leather creased from Afghanistan and Iraq and 3 other countries that existed on maps in classified briefings. Marcus had worn them for his first deployment. She'd worn them for her last. She stared at them for approximately 6 seconds. Then she slammed the trunk shut without touching them. The Portland rain came that evening, the kind of rain that felt personal, cold enough to be intentional. Laura drove north through the city toward Riverview Cemetery, toward the plot she'd visited exactly once before, 8 years ago in daylight. The entrance gates were closed at dusk, but she knew where the maintenance access opened. She'd researched this cemetery when Marcus died. You didn't stop learning tactical approaches just because you were grieving. The grave was simple. Military headstone. White marble with an engraved anchor. HMC Marcus Bennett, Navy SEAL, 1978 to 2015. No poetry, no sentiment. Just rank, name, and dates. 71 months. That's what his life compressed to. 71 months of service above the span of his entire existence. Laura knelt in the mud. Her scrubs, she'd forgotten to change out of her scrubs, were soaked instantly. Rain hammered her shoulders like a second body pressing her down. She placed her forehead against the wet marble of the headstone, and the thing she'd trained 16 years not to do finally happened. The composure cracked. I saved that ranger's life like I saved 40 others in Kandahar, she whispered, and her voice fractured on the words like ice under weight. And I still failed. I can't do this anymore, Marcus. I can't keep pretending I'm not broken. The rain mixed with tears, and she didn't try to stop it. She just knelt there at the grave of a man who'd chosen duty and paid with his life, and she understood that she'd been paying in installments ever since. That hiding hadn't saved her. That anonymity hadn't healed her. That becoming someone else had just made the original trauma wear a different uniform. She would have stayed there all night. But at 10:33 p.m., headlights cut through the cemetery darkness. A truck pulled off the access road. 16-year-old Ethan Bennett, her son, the boy she'd raised with meticulous emotional distance, climbed out with his phone still tracking her location. "Mom," he said. Just that word. Just her name in his voice. Laura looked up at him, rain running down her face, 16 years of military training useless against the sight of her child standing in darkness and choosing to find her anyway. Ethan helped her to the truck without speaking. She was shaking, not from cold, but from the deep cellular tremor of someone whose entire structural system had finally failed. He didn't try to comfort her. He just drove her home and left her at her bedroom door, and then he went to the garage. There were 4 cardboard boxes on a shelf above the workbench. They'd been there since 2015, untouched, labeled in Marcus's handwriting, Navy stuff, do not touch. Ethan opened them. What he found changed everything. The Oregon Medical Board investigation moved with the kind of ruthless efficiency that only comes when institutional power realizes it has been weaponized against itself. While Laura's shadow box sat empty in her garage and Ethan stared at his mother's medals in the gray Portland rain, Robert Chen, the IT specialist with the Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm and the kind of moral compass that points directly north, was methodically rebuilding what Dr. Hargrove had tried to erase. The evidence sat on a single hard drive. A backup Chen had created before Hargrove's deletion cascade ever began. Chen walked into the emergency ethics hearing carrying that drive like a soldier carries a classified briefcase. The hospital administrator, the 3 board members, and Hargrove's attorney, a sharp-edged woman in a charcoal suit who billed at $300 an hour, all watched as Chen inserted it into the conference room's projection system. The screen flickered. Then the timestamp appeared, 14:37 on the day of Laura's emergency pericardiocentesis. Security footage from Bay 4. Laura's hands moving with the precision of someone whose muscle memory was older than her civilian life. The needle going in. The hiss of fluid releasing. The monitor climbing, 75. 82, 88. The ranger's blood pressure stabilizing like a rescuer breaking the surface of dark water. Then the second timestamp. 14:52, 15 minutes later. Hargrove's office. His computer. Chen's voice came steady and quiet as he narrated, Dr. Hargrove receives notification that the security footage has been automatically backed up to the hospital server. Standard protocol. He does not review the footage. Instead, he opens the deletion menu. The screen showed his cursor moving. Selecting files. His hand hovering. At 14:53, he initiates the deletion cascade. Files began disappearing. One by one. The footage vanishing like footprints being erased from snow. But Chen had frozen the moment at 15:04. That's when I intercepted the deletion request, Chen said. I preserved every frame before they were purged. And I documented exactly what Dr. Hargrove was trying to eliminate. He clicked forward. The footage returned. The entire emergency procedure. Hargrove's original chart. The patient's intake paperwork showing the pericardial shrapnel fragment was never documented in Hargrove's initial assessment. Never even suspected. One board member, a woman with white hair and 30 years of nursing experience, closed her eyes. Chen continued. I also filed a report with hospital administration and the Oregon Medical Board within 2 hours of detecting the deletion attempt. Those reports are dated and logged. He pulled up the timestamps. This wasn't a system malfunction. This was intentional destruction of evidence related to patient care. The room didn't make a sound. Not even the fluorescent lights buzzed. Just the hum of the projector and Chen's voice like a judge reading a verdict that had already been decided before anyone entered the courtroom. But Chen wasn't finished. Not even close. He presented the GPS data from Hargrove's phone. The timeline showed that while Laura was performing her emergency procedure, the procedure that saved the ranger's life, Hargrove had been at the Riverside Country Club. His location tag placed him exactly 4.7 miles from Oak Creek Memorial. Driving time back to the hospital, 12 minutes. He didn't show up for 28 minutes. He didn't check the pages that came through about the cardiac tamponade emergency. He didn't answer his phone when the code team called. He was discussing his handicap on the 18th hole. Then Chen presented the medical records. Hargrove's original examination of the Ranger. The documentation that was supposed to list his injuries. The shrapnel fragment embedded near the pericardium, the one that should have been visible on any competent physical exam, was never mentioned. Never even considered. The admission note read, "Stable veteran, prognosis guarded, recommend conservative observation, complex cases better suited for larger facilities." Translation: I don't want to deal with this. A VA surgeon who had trained at Johns Hopkins reviewed Hargrove's exam notes and submitted a written statement. This represents a failure to perform a basic trauma assessment. The pericardial involvement should have been evident on percussion alone. This is not a judgment call. This is negligence. Then the board discovered something worse. A pattern. 3 other disabled veterans had arrived at Oak Creek Memorial in the previous 18 months with complex trauma cases. All 3 had been evaluated by Hargrove. All 3 had been refused treatment. All 3 had been transferred to other facilities. All 3 had been successfully treated elsewhere, their surgeries completed without complications. One of those veterans sent a statement, "Dr. Hargrove told me my injuries were beyond the hospital's capabilities. I went to Seattle General. They fixed me in 4 hours." Apparently Oregon medical standards are different depending on where you come from. The resident who had panicked during the cardiac tamponade, Dr. Patel, young and terrified, testified that Hargrove had standing orders about veteran cases. All veteran cases had to be routed through him first. His exact quote from the operations manual, "I will determine if we have capacity." Dr. Patel's voice shook as he said it. He was the gatekeeper. He was deciding which veterans got care and which didn't. I never questioned it because he was the chief of surgery. Charge nurse Rita sat in the witness chair with her hands folded. The board asked her about the phone call Hargrove made to her at home, the one where he pressured her into documenting Laura's insubordination. Rita's jaw tightened. She'd been a nurse for 23 years. She knew the difference between leadership and coercion. "He told me to make sure Laura's behavior was recorded as a pattern," Rita said, her voice carrying the weight of betrayal. "He said the hospital's interests depended on it. He never once mentioned his own misdiagnosis. He never once said he was afraid of a lawsuit. It was about protecting his reputation, not his patients." The 2 board members who had taken Hargrove's phone calls testified next. They sat uncomfortably in the witness box, men who had made their careers in hospital administration, men who understood that loyalty to colleagues came before loyalty to protocol. But the evidence had a way of dissolving all that. Hargrove's calls to them had been framed as protecting hospital interests and managing difficult personnel. Neither one mentioned his misdiagnosis. Neither one was told that his original exam had been incomplete. Neither one realized they were being used to destroy evidence and eliminate a witness. Captain James Torres sat in the hearing room wearing his dress uniform. Navy blue with ribbons that marked decades of sacrifice. He submitted a 20-page affidavit detailing Laura Bennett's qualifications in meticulous, devastating precision. Senior Chief Petty Officer. Combat surgical operations in Marja, Kandahar, and Helmand Province. Personally saved 127 American lives under fire. Trained over 300 special operations medics, 56 of whom were currently deployed and submitted letters of support. The Defense Superior Service Medal. 3 Purple Hearts. Bronze Star with Valor. Navy Cross. Senior Chief Bennett, Torres wrote, is one of the most highly trained trauma specialists in the United States military. She has saved more lives than most trauma surgeons see in a career. Her experience with complex blast injuries is unmatched. The fact that she performed a flawless emergency pericardiocentesis under impossible circumstances proves not that she overstepped her role, but that her training was exactly what the patient needed. 12 other special operations veterans submitted statements. Each one carried the same weight. Each one was a name. A face. A life saved. A debt of honor that Hargrove's negligence had come close to erasing. The Ranger's wife came last. She sat in the witness chair with her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. The board gave her space to speak. She used it. 15 doctors refused my husband, she said, and her voice didn't shake because she had already cried all the tears she had. 15 doctors looked at his scars and his wounds and decided he wasn't worth the effort. One nurse saw him as a person. One nurse saw that he was worth saving. And you fired her. She paused. The silence in the room felt like pressure. Like the air before a thunderstorm. My husband is alive because of her. My children have their father. And you gave her a termination letter. The medical board hearing lasted for hours. Hargrove's attorney presented the defense with the precision of someone fighting on quicksand. Administrative discretion. Reasonable clinical judgment. Proper channels for scope concerns. Protocols for credentialing. Every word was correct. Every argument was technically sound. Every single point was rendered meaningless by the evidence stacked against it like dominoes waiting for the first one to fall. The board chairman was a retired neurosurgeon named Dr. Helen Vasquez. She had trained at Mayo. She had served on 3 national medical boards. She had seen competence and incompetence, ethics and corruption, mercy and cruelty. She knew the difference between a difficult case and a deliberate refusal. She knew the difference between caution and cowardice. She read the verdict without looking at Hargrove. The Oregon Medical Board finds that Dr. Marcus Hargrove engaged in gross negligence by failing to perform an adequate trauma assessment. We find evidence of patient abandonment in the systematic refusal of care to disabled veterans. We find willful destruction of evidence related to patient care. We find abuse of institutional authority to intimidate witnesses and silence whistleblowers. The medical board hereby revokes the medical license of Dr. Marcus Hargrove, effective immediately. He is prohibited from practicing medicine in the state of Oregon or any state in which he holds licensure. He is required to notify all malpractice insurers of this action within 30 days. Case closed. Hargrove sat motionless. Not shock. Not denial. Just the particular emptiness that comes when you realize the game is over and you lost on all counts. His attorney packed files into a leather briefcase. The reporters outside the hearing room surged forward like water finding the lowest point. Hargrove didn't look at them. He walked past with his eyes fixed on the middle distance, the way people do when they can't bear to see their own reflection. When he got home that afternoon, his wife was already gone. Her car was gone from the driveway. Her clothes were gone from the closet. The separation papers were on the kitchen counter, dated that morning. She had filed before the verdict was even read. She had already chosen her exit. His office at the hospital was being dismantled by maintenance staff. The walls were bare where his diplomas had hung. The plaques commemorating his donations were coming down. His name was being sandblasted off the surgical wing dedication, a name that had meant prestige and power 2 weeks ago, now being erased like graffiti. He stood in the emptied office and looked at the cardboard box on his desk. A desk plant. A coffee mug from a medical conference in 2015. The detritus of a career that had been built on authority rather than ability, on fear rather than respect. He picked up the box. His hands were shaking. He looked at them like they belonged to someone else. His phone rang. A former colleague. Someone who had attended his holiday parties, who had texted him birthday wishes, who had sent congratulations when he made chief of surgery. Marcus, I'm calling to tell you that I won't be able to provide you a reference. I hope you understand. My career depends on it. Hargrove didn't answer. He set the phone down on the empty desk and didn't pick it up again. 6 months later, you could find him in a strip mall on the southeast side of Portland, sitting behind a folding table with a banner that read Platinum Supplemental Insurance, licensed agent in red and gold letters that had started to peel in the afternoon heat. His desk was a card table with a laptop running insurance calculators and a printer that jammed constantly. The chair was plastic with one leg slightly shorter than the others, so he sat tilted at a permanent angle, like a ship listing in still water. People walked past him every day. Mothers coming out of the nail salon. Teenagers heading to the gym. Construction workers grabbing coffee. Nobody stopped. Nobody made eye contact. Nobody wanted what he was selling. He had a quota now. 30 policies a month to make base commission. Last month he'd sold 4. The manager at the office, a guy named Derek who sold medical waste disposal systems, had told him that if next month was the same, they'd have to let him go. Derek had hired him as a favor to someone who had known someone. That debt was about to be called due. Hargrove sat at his folding table and watched the world move past him and understood, with perfect clarity, what it felt like to be invisible. To be untethered. To be nothing. That was the price. 6 months before Hargrove's table, Laura Bennett stepped through the doors of Oak Creek Memorial wearing navy scrubs with Director of Emergency Medical Services embroidered on the chest. The hospital board had created the position specifically for her. They had publicly apologized. They had offered her a signing bonus, flex scheduling, and full administrative authority over the emergency department's protocols. More importantly, they had listened. Ethan helped her carry the shadow box to her new office on the 3rd floor. He was 17 now, growing into his father's height, wearing a navy rock shirt that meant something Laura hadn't expected to feel, pride mixed with something closer to permission. Permission to let her son follow a path she had spent years trying to make him avoid. She hung the shadow box on the wall where the morning light could reach it. The worn combat boots that Marcus had given her before his final deployment sat in mahogany and glass. Beside them, a photograph of Marcus in dress whites. A photograph of Laura in her service dress navy uniform, her ribbons catching the light. 2 names. 2 service records. 2 people who had believed in something bigger than safety. Dad would be proud, Ethan said. Laura touched the glass. Her reflection looked back at her, not as a nurse, not as a veteran, but as both. Whole. So would your grandfather, she said quietly. Ethan's eyes widened. What? Your grandfather? Your father's father? Admiral James Bennett. Navy SEAL, 3 deployments, killed in action during Operation Neptune Spear. Your father was named after him. And your father followed. Laura's voice was steady. I've hidden so much from you. I'm not hiding anymore. The ranger came to her office on a Thursday morning, moving slowly with a cane but moving on his own. His wife and 2 children walked behind him. He was wearing a polo shirt that made him look almost civilian except for the way he stood, shoulders squared, spine straight, eyes sharp. He saluted when he entered her office. Senior Chief Bennett saluted back. Her hand didn't shake. The trembling that had lived in her hands for 12 years, the legacy of keeping secrets, of burying trauma, of pretending to be smaller than she was, had finally released. Thank you, Senior Chief, the ranger said. For my life. Welcome to Oak Creek, Ranger, Laura replied. You're home. And that's what we do at home. We take care of our own. Dr. Chen, the VA surgeon who had recognized the Kabul suture technique, joined the staff as a consulting trauma specialist. Rita brought Laura coffee that first morning, the same way Laura had brought her coffee during night shifts, the roles reversing like tides, like the way power works when it's genuinely earned. The hospital lobby now displayed a plaque, Center for Veteran Care Excellence, established in honor of Senior Chief Petty Officer Laura Bennett. Below it, the statistics, 412 veterans treated. 97 lives saved in the first year alone. A program now being replicated at 17 other hospitals across Oregon and Washington. That evening, Laura drove to Marcus's grave in daylight. She brought flowers. She knelt at his headstone and pressed her palm against the stone. I'm done hiding, she told him. Ethan knows everything now. The boots are on my wall. I'm still broken, Marcus, but I'm not pretending anymore. I'm healing. And I'm helping others do the same. She stood in her scrubs, her senior chief insignia visible, the weight of her rank and her reputation no longer something to carry in shame, but something to carry forward. At 2 in the morning, in the emergency department of Oak Creek Memorial, Laura stood with 3 residents gathered around her. She was teaching them the Kabul suture technique. the specialized method for binding deep blast wounds under field conditions. The procedure she had learned under fire in places where helicopters came too late and improvisation meant the difference between living and dying. Her hands moved with the authority of someone who had earned every scar, every medal, every moment of her own hard-won certainty. "Watch the angle," she told them. "The goal is to distribute tension evenly. This isn't textbook surgery. This is combat medicine. This is what you do when you have 30 seconds and a bleeder that won't stop." One of the residents, a young man from Ohio, maybe 28, watched her hands with the reverence you only see when someone realizes they're standing in the presence of actual expertise. "Senior Chief, how many times have you done this?" Laura didn't pause. She didn't look up from her work. "More than I like to remember. Less than I should have." She finished the suture. The demonstration was complete. The wound was sealed. The bleeding had stopped. She looked at the residents and saw futures. These young people would save lives, would carry forward what she had taught them, would pass it to others, a chain of knowledge and skill and compassion that never ended. "Any other questions?" she asked. Nobody spoke. They had their answer. And if you're watching right now, if you've heard this story and felt something shift inside you, that feeling of injustice finally righted, of quiet strength finally recognized, of systems failing but people prevailing, I want to hear from you. Share this story. Tell me about the nurses, the medics, the hospital workers, the veteran services professionals who stood against corruption and won. Tell me about the times you watched someone in scrubs do something extraordinary while nobody was watching. Comment below. Subscribe. Because these stories matter. These people matter. And the truth is, sometimes the person making the smallest noise in the room is the only one brave enough to be heard.